Thank you for checking out this ResearchCraft interview. I'm Robert Carl. One of my goals with this series is to demystify the process of doing history for people at all levels. That's why for this second installment, I've invited on Sam Kao and Jackson Vail, seniors at Rutgers and Princeton who are just starting to think about their undergraduate theses. We chat about early steps of the process, like selecting an advisor and what might get accomplished over the summer before senior year, and discuss as well technical matters like Zotero. The normal anxieties of undertaking such a large academic project are amplified by the disruptions of COVID, so these conversations are especially important right now. Let's get to them. Sam and Jackson, thanks again for doing this. I'm excited for the conversation. Do you just want to say a little bit about your interests as you move into thinking about your senior theses for the next academic year? Jackson, why don't you start?
Sure, I can start. So I'm sort of at stage one, or sort of had to revert back to stage one. I was originally planning to do a thesis like related to mid 20th century Bolivia and sort of colonization of the eastern lowlands, and sort of taking an environmental angle. And then for obvious reasons, my trip to archives in Bolivia was canceled. So I'm sort of reevaluating what I want this project to look like, and then also sort of necessarily thinking about the limits to source material. So I'm still interested in pursuing an environmental project, but I'm reconsidering the sort of geographic scope of it. Maybe thinking about a North American project or a transnational project. But I've also thought about sort of switching it up altogether. Now as I'm sort of influenced by the current political moment and thinking about abolition and rebellion and protest. That's certainly giving me a lot to think about in terms of what I want to come of my thesis. So yeah, I'm considering a couple different strands.
Yeah. Well, we can come back to this, but there's a question about whether you want to continue to look for an advisor who works on your broad thematic interests or on the geographic region. So,
right.
Even if you do an environmental topic on Latin America, do you want to work with an environmental historian, or do you want to work with someone who knows the region but not necessarily is as familiar with the historiography of environmental history?
Right, exactly.
So, yeah. And Sam, how about you?
Yeah, so I'm interested in studying the economics department at UCLA in like the mid-century, 1960s, 1970s, and sort of in addition to the wider literature that's been going on recently on the history of neoliberalism, but also I don't want to just do an intellectual history project. I'm interested in the politics of higher education in the United States, particularly California. And I also really want to look at the sort of student activism that was going on in the 60s and all those other 60s social movements and the way they intersected with the academy. And also I'm interested in, I guess, the transition from Fordism to neoliberalism and the way higher education operates within that transformation. And I'm specifically interested in how a lot of the intellectuals within the UCLA econ department help bring about that transformation.
Okay, good. Yeah, so this is a topic that in some ways lends itself to the kinds of online research that we're forced to do right now. So do you want to talk about some of the sources that you've thought about and have begun to look for?
Yeah, so I know from this interview that was conducted with one of the former chair of the department that there was a lot of local media coverage of the events during that time on campus. So obviously Los Angeles Times, that's a pretty obvious source. The campus paper of UCLA, the Daily Bruin. And the nice thing about studying scholars is they obviously produce a lot of written documents that you can analyze. So all their papers, books, and so forth are definitely available and definitely findable. So there's no shortage of primary sources that I could find online, even without going to archives, which is really good right now.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. Well, so at this very early stage, and I should add, I'm really hoping this will be the first of several conversations we can have over the course of your senior year about the process. So what questions do you have at this early moment?
I think you touched on this earlier, but I guess, and like you talked about this a little bit with Jackson, but I guess finding an advisor is something that I'm a little unsure about right now. Like, you mentioned this, like geographic versus thematic. How do you choose? I guess that's something that I'm thinking about.
Yeah. So I think it's helpful here to begin to think about what you hope to accomplish with the senior thesis. And we're especially cognizant in this moment of limits in terms of size and source material and other obligations and distractions we have going on. So it's really but that's just an accentuated version of the sort of perennial issue with independent student research, which is, you want to do a project on X, but you have to realize you only have the sources available to you at your university or online, and there's only so much you can do in a year. So do sort of set your expectations accordingly. And Sam, you talked a little bit with me earlier about your interest in social theory and potentially bringing that into the thesis more than might be common with a lot of history theses.
Mm-hmm.
Given that's the case, you might think about your thesis as an exercise in that. Yes, you want to tell this story, but you're thinking about going to law school, you're thinking about going to grad school, what have you, and you have an interest in that engagement with social theory. So maybe rather than looking for someone who does the history of higher education or US history in the same period, maybe think about finding an advisor who has a real background in social theory and might be interested in working with you on that part. Because there are other mechanisms, be it a senior thesis research seminar or boot camps, what have you, even conversations with previous advisors, where you can do a lot of really talk about more of the archival stuff, the constructing a project, writing the project. So given that you have this other interest, you might think about how choosing an advisor could really help you to advance that.
Mm-hmm.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. Jackson, what questions do you have at this early stage?
I think one question that I have that I know I'll continue to have throughout the process is about the scope of the project, and sort of setting the right bounds for sort of the questions I'm asking. That was a constant sort of concern of mine while I was writing my junior papers. And now, obviously, like, I've written junior papers, but haven't written sort of a thesis length project. And I'm thinking about how to best like prepare for that, even though I know things will develop as I go.
Mm-hmm.
And then also thinking about how, like, for instance, only being able to access digital sources, if it ends up being that way, like, how does that impact sort of the scope of the questions that I'm asking?
I feel like we're in like the reverse steroids era in baseball, where every piece of academic work during this time, be it an article or a thesis, just needs an asterisk next to the title, being like, this could have been something else, but we were limited in the kinds of resources we had access to. Okay, so I think we can approach this two different ways. One is how one goes about moving from a set of interests to a real concrete research topic. I mean, Sam's slightly exceptional in some ways in that he has a really concrete set of institutional actors and other processes that he's interested in. But even there, the sort of second piece of the process comes into consideration. Sorry, my cat is being very aggressively lovey on the laptop screen. So you figure out, okay, here are roughly the things I'm interested in. Here are some primary sources, archival collections that may be available on it. And then it's really a question of changing that as you go through the sources. And it's really following what your historical actors and the limits of the sources you have enable you to do. So I think that's the first and a very important consideration, not just for the thesis, but then also for any piece of undergraduate independent work or graduate independent work, or the kind of work that professional historians do. So the second consideration, I think you should expect to maybe be able to finish 80 75% of what you set out to write at the beginning of the year. So I advised a lot of history theses at Princeton, and it very often happened that a student ran out of time at the end, so didn't get to write the fourth chapter that they had been planning since the fall. Maybe even didn't even get to write a conclusion. There was a last section of the third chapter that turned into a bit of an epilogue. My own senior thesis a long time ago, I'd planned to have it be about Kennedy and then Johnson's Latin America policies, but it only ended up being about Kennedy. And I remember very late in the process telling my advisor that, and she just smiled at me and she's like, good, I'm glad you've seen the light. So I think these are very common issues, again, structural limitations of time and resources that undergraduates run into. So it's a very natural part of the process. So I wouldn't worry too much about it. Anything you can do to sort of set that anxiety to the side is, I think, valuable because it allows you to focus on the work itself. And again, so much of this will come out. So many of these questions will get resolved through the work process itself.
I guess another sort of more concrete question I have, just out of curiosity, is if there's any sort of, whether it's related to Zotero or just in general, any sort of like research methods that are particularly helpful for, like, I guess for maybe for JP or thesis, but specifically for thesis, that have come up that might be like different than how you would go about like talking to a professional colleague about their methods.
That's a great question. So let me say something about what you might think of doing or how you might approach these months leading up to senior year. Jackson, you were going to have a leg up. You were going to have this summer to do research and come into senior year doing that. I often tell students, if they're coming back to the campus a few weeks earlier or before the start of the semester for a job or whatever, even if you can get a few hours in looking at microfilm that you couldn't have access to somewhere else, that's going to enable you to do a bit more and really hit the ground running in the fall. Even if that's not possible, try to read 4 or 5 books, set up a goal of 1 or 2 books every couple weeks over the summer, because that's going to put you ahead of the majority of your classmates. And I should say too, Princeton requires every undergraduate to write a senior thesis. So it's a different set of sort of cultural standards and so on around senior theses than you might find at some other schools. In this section, we'll walk through using Zotero. Jackson's already referenced it, and it comes up a lot throughout ResearchCraft. For those of you unfamiliar with it, Zotero is a free open-source citation management tool. I love it because it not only helps you format footnotes and bibliographies, but it can also be used to extract annotations, automatically rename PDFs, and facilitate collaboration. I have another series of YouTube videos that detail how to set up workflow hacks relying on Zotero. One additional note, I didn't have the right screen sharing settings enabled when we recorded this interview in Zoom, so I've had to splice in segments from another video throughout the section. In terms of the technical ways to approach the thesis, if you don't have Zotero, familiarize yourself with it. It's going to serve you well even outside of the senior thesis in terms of just formatting citations and the other really basic stuff that's not worth doing by hand. And I think too, at this early stage, there's a lot of value. Okay, you're going to even just start running a couple of library catalog searches on your topic. Just saving those titles to a folder in Zotero is going to have a lot of value, and just starting to get organized. Would you guys like to walk through Zotero quickly? Would that be helpful?
Sure, yeah.
I'm going to start with how Zotero might not actually work out for you. So Sam, I checked out the Daily Bruin website.
Yeah, I looked at it too. It's the digitalization is there, but it's not great. It's like it's like JPEGs of each thing, and they're not indexed. Like they're indexed, but like it's like you have to like look at the JPEGs and like pick out the day and everything. It's not great, but like at least it's there. It could be worse.
Yeah, so it's an okay interface. Here's January 1968. If we click and try to save the Zotero or the metadata from this website into Zotero, it's not going to just give us January whatever 1964. It's just going to give us a generic Daily Bruin archive. So, you know, it's not the original date. The link is there, but not anything else. And actually, let's see if that's even a help at all. Okay, so that did a little bit better than I had originally thought. It's confusing because you can see January 2020 up here, but it has taken us to our page from the 1960s. So let's actually go on a little bit. This isn't as bad as I expected. All right. So the URL is changing day by day. So that's good at least. So if we saved this, Zotero is going to save a copy of the web page. Okay, so you can see there it defaults back to our landing page from 2020, which is too bad. So you could take this site, if you find an article that was useful, grab it in Zotero, and then maybe, Sam, you'd want to take a screenshot, and then you can attach that to the Zotero item in order to have the metadata, which is to say all the citation information attached to the primary source itself. So this is sort of in between. It's not as bad as I thought when I initially went to it. It's a little inconvenient, but you know, at least you have a URL. You can't open up this archive piece here that Zotero's captured, but you could always paste that URL back into your browser to get back to that particular day that was interesting. So that's good. Okay, let's see. Let's do a different example. So we'll deselect all the papers here. Do you have a name of one of your economists?
Alchian, Alchian.
Okay, so we've got a bunch of hits there. It looks like citations of papers. Oh, okay, UCLA school product could be delivered to the Fed. So that's actually in the Wall Street Journal, not in the LA Times. That's slightly later. It's from 1991. Let's just use this as an example,
Okay.
hypothetically. So I think students, given the current situation, are going to be using newspapers more for primary source research than might be the case. And I think there's a lot of value in sitting down, giving yourself an hour or two to just say, okay, tonight's the night I'm going to look at the Daily Worker or the Wall Street Journal and do targeted searches. If you don't find anything, that's great. You can sort of check it off your list. It's only was a half hour of your time, maybe even less, but it's going to be really important because looking at different kinds of newspapers and different kinds of sources more generally is going to lead to the kinds of creative fictions that are going to drive a lot of the historical analysis in your piece. So a couple ways I would approach the newspaper research. One, you can actually save a search in ProQuest. You have to create, I think you have to create a separate account, but it's worth it, or get the search link. So here I would keep really good notes. I've been frustrated before where I've started looking through 600 results in ProQuest newspapers, only to then rerun the search under slightly different parameters, and it's a different 600, so I have no idea where I was in the process. So getting the search link or saving the search is really helpful. The other thing with Zotero that's nice, if you see this folder here, so here are all the articles on this page of search results, and if I, let's see, pick those two, for instance. it's gone ahead and saved those. And then I have the Zotero add-on Zot file, which has renamed them according to the metadata of the author and the title contained in that were attached to the article. So that's really nice. In terms of primary sources, this is a good way to approach it. Pick a range of years, if you've got 2 regional case studies in the thesis, pick the newspapers from one for one set of searches, pick the other regions for another, and then also do the national newspapers as a third search. This is a way to, again, make it really approachable. I don't know if you two are familiar with Anne Lamott's famous book about the creative process, Bird by Bird.
Yeah, I think you tweeted about it before.
Yeah, I've tweeted about it a lot of times. It's really an indispensable sort of reassurance about the creative process. So I encourage people to look that up. Again, I've tweeted about it. If you search Bird by Bird and my handle on Twitter, you'll find how I've treated it, or maybe how I've incorporated it into my teaching. But just sort of breaking up a project into these sort of easily digestible chunks is a good way to approach it and to really break down the bigness of the whole thing. And I should say that trick of using the folder icon for Zotero in the web browser is also going to work. Go ahead and pick a title that you're interested in for your thesis. Actually, I have to click catalog.
Yeah, Slobodian's work has been pretty essential for me.
Jackson, to go back to your question, certainly I would start mining the bibliographies and citations of a couple of important works in the field that whatever topic I'm working on.
Yeah.
You should do the same. Start looking through stuff this summer, and at least if you do nothing else but have a reading list going into the fall, it's worth it. Okay, yeah. So here again is that folder icon. We select whatever we want there, put it into Zotero. There's one other little trick here, which can be helpful. You could select all the relevant results, put them in Zotero, and then you could export that as a CSV, as a spreadsheet. Then you can sort by the call number column, and that's your lineup of library items. So rather than going through and writing everything down by hand, just check it on your phone. I would export it to a CSV, put it on a Google Sheet or some other cloud document. That's a really basic trick that has saved me a lot of time. Historiography can be a vexing part of the historian's craft, one which plenty of history students never get formally introduced to. In this section of our conversation, we discuss various definitions of historiography and consider how it fits into historical analysis. Historiography is also a tough topic to teach and can't be covered comprehensively in a short amount of time. Yet this is a good start to what will be a recurring conversation throughout this series. Sam, you had a question when we spoke earlier this week about historiography, which I think ties in nicely. So it's sort of we've been approaching this from a technical question. We could get into a sort of more methodological consideration for a moment. First of all, do you want to define historiography?
Oh, yeah. So I define it as sort of the set of pre-existing narratives about given historical events or stuff in general. And these are generally written not necessarily by professional historians, but often by professional historians. And they sort of offer different tellings of what happened. And the short way, as you put it, is the history of history. That's the way I've heard it used the most. But I find it more helpful to think of it as a set of narratives.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. So maybe not the what of history and the acts, and this distinction between the past and history is something we've seen a lot amidst these debates about what to do with the statues of Columbus and the Confederate generals and whatnot. So not treating history as a fixed thing, but as a subject of debate. So historiography is, as you said, looking at those narratives and the way that different, not necessarily historians, but scholars, other observers have approached a particular topic. Jackson, in the way you've studied historiography, is there anything you'd want to add to that definition?
You pretty much covered it. I just always think about it as working on secondary sources instead of primary sources, but like secondary sources can themselves be very fruitful,
Yes.
like primary sources, in the sense of you're just studying how other people have reacted to an event over time.
Yeah. So in some ways, whether you're working with primary or secondary sources, in both cases, you're going to be running into these conflicting narratives. And I think that's one of the most important things for history students to understand, is when you come across conflicting narratives, that's not a reason to stop and sort of throw up your hands or leave your analysis at a simplistic point. It's precisely where those two narratives come into contact, whether that's two firsthand accounts that you're coming across in primary sources or two different historical accounts. The tension, the frictions there, the gaps, the overlaps are going to be where a lot of the analysis is going to come through or come from. The example I cite most often is one of the first undergrad research papers that I advised in my career. The student bemoaned the fact that Britain didn't have the equivalent of a Freedom of Information Act. So it wasn't possible for him to find primary sources about British clandestine intelligence operations during the Cold War. And I said, well, why doesn't Britain have a Freedom of Information Act in the same way that the United States does? So that actually became the subject of his research paper. He looked at parliamentary debates about government secrecy and transparency, and it was a really fantastic piece of research. So whether it's with secondary sources, whether it's with primary sources, it's very helpful to think about the work of a historian in that way. So Sam, you had another question that you emailed me before today's conversation about sort of historical schools.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, that sort of connects back to the earlier point I made about thinking about being reasonable about the expectations you have for your thesis and the limits. You know, there may be ways in which you can tie the particular literature around your topic to these broader debates about social history, about cultural history, the revival of diplomatic history. And there would be a lot of richness there, but that may be too much. I often refer to sort of a undergraduate research lottery, where you're going to pick a topic, you're going to end up with a certain set of sources. You know, it's going to enable that combination is going to enable you to do some things very well, but some things are really going to remain beyond your reach. So it's a great thing to think about, and maybe you learn a lot through your courses senior year and then the research process about those kinds of issues, about broader historical schools, rather than debates among historians within a certain subfield around a certain topic. But it may be that that thinking and that work doesn't end up in the thesis as much as you had originally hoped.
Yeah, I don't really see that as I don't really see myself incorporating that into the thesis. But I guess this is more of just like orienting myself about how to like read various things and like how to like get a frame of reference, because I hear a lot of this stuff being thrown around like casually, because I assume historians already know this stuff, but as someone who doesn't quite know this stuff yet, it was just very kind of confusing to just see this stuff being thrown around very casually.
Yeah, and I think you're referring specifically to a couple conversations that have happened on Twitter.
Yeah, on
recently.
Twitter.
Yeah,
like a lot of conversations on Twitter that I see.
Yeah. I looked at some of the ones that you mentioned. You know, in some ways, that's actually a digestible way to get into some of these debates. You really have to know sort of who to follow, and it's very possible that the field you're working in doesn't have extremely online historians, probably to their and your benefit. But if you happen to find a debate, I mean, the one you sent me was a conversation Danny Bessner had started about sort of the place of military history within diplomatic history of U.S., the history of U.S. and the world. You may not understand 75% of the references in that tweet, in that thread or that conversation, but that 25% could be really valuable. You know, you see an insight, you understand, okay, they're talking about these two authors in connection with one another. I should check out their books, but then I'm also going to understand from reading it that there is a connection between the two, and that scholars are thinking about them in a similar way, putting them in conversation. And that may actually help to in bridging that sort of thematic versus geographic gap.
Right.
So maybe a particular set of concerns in environmental history, Jackson, haven't been applied in the Latin American context. But the debates from, say, US environmental history are something you could bring to the set of topics you're working on.
Right.
Yeah. So, I mean, the historiography on Twitter is going to be extremely hit or miss. But you may get lucky, as with any part of the research process. Sam, is there anything else you wanted to bring in about this sort of historiography in schools? It's certainly a topic I hope we can return to if we follow up on these conversations during the year.
I feel like right now, probably we don't have to talk about going to super in depth. I think I asked the question more out of like personal curiosity than like also like just figuring out how to orient myself around all the material than like actually intervening in this debate. I mean, I wouldn't presume to intervene in this debate as an undergraduate. So I think we can move on to other stuff.
Well, let's say COVID travel restrictions are lifted, even if even if it's just to go up to New York to the New York Public Library or another regional archive, what that experience might look like. Sam, did you have any specific questions around this?
Not specifically. I guess like I'm still like just anxious about going anywhere. But yeah, like that's definitely something that's kind of in the back of my mind about like what to do about like travel restrictions and like worried about getting coronavirus and so forth.
I mean, the only other times in my life that I've worn a surgical mask and maybe gloves have been in certain archives, and I hate that experience has now become, you know, our expanded everyday reality. Yeah. So, you know, I've had these videos about archival methods. You might be more familiar with the ones about the Zotero stuff that we just went over, but you might want to look there. I mean, if you're working in U.S. archives, I think they're going to be much better documented. You know, it's going to be much easier to find an online catalog or even just a catalog in PDF that the archivist sends you. So I can't stress enough the importance of preparatory work and getting to the archive the first day and being able to request stuff that you think might be valuable and being very systematic about that. Checking things off. Okay, here's the date that I looked at this box. I took pictures of it. I didn't take any pictures from this box, and so on. I've also tweeted long thread over the course of many months about how to use regular expressions. One could actually do it in Python to sort of extract relevant results from a PDF and export them to a spreadsheet. So if you want a slightly more technical fix, like you have a certain set of parameters that you know you're searching for within a PDF document, how to extract those and put them into a spreadsheet. So that's a little technical, but it saves you. It could potentially save you a lot of copying and pasting. Let's put it that way. Now, Jackson, could you maybe tell us about some of your experiences working with primary sources on the junior papers that you wrote last year?
Sure. I had a good the contrast between the two of them is interesting. I like my spring junior paper is I guess a good segue into thesis in the time of COVID, because I had to sort of it was mostly one digitized primary source collection and then just sort of riffing off of that without much secondary source material to go with it. In the fall I wrote about the TVA, the Tennessee Valley Authority, during the New Deal, and specifically sort of I looked at David Lilienthal's papers at Mudd Library at Princeton. David Lilienthal was one of the directors of the TVA, so I was looking at his sort of characterization of the TVA as a democratic entity, a highly democratic entity. And that was good because it was sort of a archive 101 type experience. So I got to think about all those things that you were saying about being prepared to go in and know what you want to look at and be sort of methodical, but also like conscious of time restrictions as you're going through, in this case, like an enormous collection of papers. And then in the spring, I was writing about the Lima Geographic Society, because their sort of institutional journal is fully digitized online and relatively easy to navigate. So yeah, and that, like I said, that was very much an analysis of the institution through the journal itself, with a couple of things that I found online, but it was definitely like abbreviated research.
Yeah. I mean, I've used the collections at different collections at Mud Library myself, and there's a good cautionary tale that I learned through that process. I went on the website; they've got great indexes for the collections. I did a search for Columbia, found a bunch of folders, I think in the Adlai Stevenson papers. But what didn't occur to me, this was a case where just a basic search sent me the wrong way. There was stuff about Columbia in folders that were labeled Latin America, and it didn't initially occur to me to look in both places. So it was only, I think, later on, as maybe the second time I went there, I happened to notice it out of the corner of my eye as I looked at the catalog again, or I got the whole box and was like, oh, I did not write this down, but there's actually more valuable material in this regional subject folder than in the specific country folder that I was looking at. So it's not just a relevant point for this archive, but sort of more broadly about how we think about the digital tools that we're using. Sam, how about you? What kinds of research experience have you had?
So I've worked with primary sources, but not so much archival work. I mean, I probably would have done something this spring, but obviously I couldn't because, everything got shut down. So I've mostly I worked a lot of databases, so the stuff you're just going over, I'm pretty familiar with. But in terms of like physical archives, not so much yet.
Okay. So Princeton students are really fortunate because Mud Library has this world-class collection of papers related to U.S. diplomacy, the history of U.S. diplomacy. Rutgers libraries actually have a number of valuable collections, say if you're working on Latin America.
Yeah, Alexander, yeah.
Yeah, the Robert Alexander papers. It's actually my first and middle name, which is always a little bit weird. But a lot of those the Robert Alexander collection has been microfilmed. So there's a good lesson there, which is if you find an archival collection that happens to be microfilmed, you figure it out over the summer, request it as soon as you get back to campus or as soon as the campus library opens back up. Because, if it takes the library 2 months to obtain the microfilm reels from somewhere else, if you wait until January to do that, you're going to be in trouble as the thesis deadline approaches. So it's another place where getting a jump can really put you ahead. So let's hope ILL reopens relatively soon in the fall. That would be clutch. All right. Any other questions you guys have?
I guess one quick thing that just came up is thinking about I was just thinking about my fall JP and how I sort of went to the Lilienthal collection as a sort of for the JP, it was relatively easy to be able to start with one guy that had sort of this robust material, but and maybe this is overly ambitious, but I guess I'm sort of more interested in, with the thesis, broadening whatever I end up writing about beyond just sort of one person, one collection. And I guess I'm thinking about how to do that, because you still need to start somewhere, but I also don't want to be too confined to one subject or one sort of conduit for analysis.
Yeah, no, I think, and that's a really natural, sort of, I don't want to call it anxiety, but sort of consideration as one considers the scope and the ambition of the process. Yeah, aim for that sort of multiplicity of archival collections and different kinds of sources. But again, particularly in the present moment, that may not be feasible at the end of the day. So this is a place where it might be helpful to think about playing around with different narrative structures or other ways of approaching the writing. So you have your first chapter that looks at Lilienthal, and then the second chapter looks at the regional newspaper, and then the third chapter is an institutional story, something like that. So, you know, Sam, in your case, you could maybe move, the first chapter is about the economics department itself. The second chapter looks more at student protests around the same time, and then you zoom up to larger considerations within higher education. So that's a way of getting different kinds of information out of different sets of sources at the same time. But I think there's an active historical imagination and creativity there as well that's worth exploring, and really could make the thesis something you're excited to push to the end of in the spring or whenever you're finishing it, and might also make it really stand out as a piece of original research. But again, who knows what we can accomplish this year? It's a question for me as well. All right. Well, if that's it for now, we'll wrap up. And again, I hope we can return and have a couple more conversations over the course of the year. So thank you again.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks for watching this installment of Research Craft. Be sure to subscribe to my YouTube page to be updated on new episodes, and also follow me on Twitter and join the conversation. I'm at R.A. Carl.